Okay, today on the bench we have a poor defenseless radio. Radio manufacturers need to start doing something. Sticking guns inside of these things. When people's hands pass a certain point, they need to shoot their fingers or something. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you don't know how to work on surface mount parts, don't work on a radio like this. Now, the main point of this video is, if you have a President McKinley and you want to unlock the clarifier, just go to my YouTube videos. I did a complete separate video on how to unlock the clarifier in these. If you watch that video, it clearly shows what parts to remove and where to pick up your voltage source for the unlock modification. I guess somebody didn't watch my video because this one, someone, I guess, attempted to do it, screwed it up, partially put it back to the way it was supposed to be, and yeah, now the clarifier just doesn't do anything because there are parts still missing. So you turn this radio on, and it's just stuck. It'll go on channel, but it's off by like 5 kilohertz, and you turn the clarifier controls, the fine and the coarse, and it has absolutely no effect on the radio. So let's get zoomed in here. The parts. So, oh, too far. Gonna come back into focus. There we go. Okay, where is my little spudger? It's over here. Okay, so if you watch that video, it shows you which parts to remove in here. This is one of them that should be removed, okay? There's a diode right here that's supposed to be removed. You're supposed to remove these 2 resistors, and I'd have to look at the schematic or watch my own video. Actually, I just need to pull the service manual. I think it's this resistor. But in any case, a part that is not supposed to be removed and must stay in the radio is a diode that's supposed to be in this location. Okay, little teeny tiny guy. Actually, I've already pulled a new one. It's, right there. Just set it on top of the crystal filter. That diode is not supposed to be removed. That diode lives right there. Now it's the same part as it is as the one here. So yeah, whoever did this didn't remove the right parts. They removed that diode. That was right. They removed that diode. That was wrong. They didn't remove the surface mount resistor they're supposed to remove, and then you're supposed to remove these 2 through-hole resistors. Now, I can tell that they had those out just by looking at it. For starters, the leads, as you can probably see, they're all warped up. These things would have been perfectly flat down against the board with nice bent leads. And then if we flip the radio over, where are we at in the camera view here? You can see, obviously, that blob of solder that attaches to that resistor should not be touching the ground plane. So yeah, sloppy soldering, trying to put these parts back in. So yeah, now, a word of advice when you're doing these, all of these parts are located, as you can see, very close to the faceplate of the radio. You've got connectors here, you know, the side of the radio. It's just hard to get down in here to these parts. If you're going to do the clarifier unlock modification on these, do yourself a favor. It only takes a minute, if that. Take out 2 screws, 2 screws. Unplug all of the plugs. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 plugs. Unplug those 4 little plugs. Remove the cable from either the faceplate or from down on the circuit board. Okay, remove it from the little cable tray. Now these cable trays have locks. So if you look on this radio, and I'll just pull this one off, you can see this little black piece right here. Okay, that's actually, it actually runs the whole way along. It's kind of hard. Actually, you can see it. No, you can't see it on that one either. It's along the back or the underside. But once I get the cable off, you'll see it. That runs underneath the bottom side. That's actually what locks that cable into that little connector so it can't fall out. So if we just come in here, fingernail on the spudger either side. Okay, it's been pulled out. Now I can reach in here and it just falls right out. Okay, you can see that entire little piece of plastic, it actually wedges wedges this flat flex cable in the connector. But remove those 4 connectors, pull the ribbon cable loose, doesn't matter from which end, the main circuit board or from the main processor board up here, or the main display board. Take out the 4 screws on the side, and then the faceplate of the radio just falls off. It just, whoop, it'll come right off. And then, actually, let's just do that. And you'll see how much easier it is to get, if you're going to do this, how much easier it is to get in there for access. And that's usually the biggest problem I think most people have when they work on surface mount. So actually, I think that's probably what I'll title this video, Access when Working on Surface Mount, or something like that. Because that is a large problem when you're trying to work on a radio. Or it doesn't necessarily even need to be a radio. It can be anything surface mount. But radios tend to be a little tricky because, unlike working on a lot of other stuff, when you take the cases or covers off, you don't have big structures like this sitting up around it, on, boxed in on 4 sides. And the little tiny microscopic parts you have to work on are down in here, so trying to get to that stuff can be hard. So you can now just take it off. See how easy that was? 4 plugs, 1 ribbon cable, 4 screws. It just falls off. Now look how easy that is to access, to get down into those little parts. Didn't take any time at all, and we can now easily come in at an angle, something that's ergonomic. That's the big thing when you're working on surface mount stuff, is ergonomics. And I'm not talking about how well a soldering iron feels in your hand. What I mean is being able to get into it. So if you want to get into where those 2 little diodes that were removed are, instead of having to try to come in from this side at a fairly steep angle, because you've got this plate in the way, or you're back here trying to get over top of this crystal filter, or coming in from this direction, you've got all these plugs and harnesses in the way. I pulled the faceplate off. I've got lots of access now, easy to get in here, and I can easily do the work without melting anything. That's the big problem. And, let's say, for example, you needed to take off, without looking really closely down here, it's hard to tell what all these parts are from a distance. But if you had to get, like, a part in between this crystal and this crystal filter here, let's say you had to change one of those little passive components down there. I would not try to get down in there like this. I would remove the crystal filter, remove the crystal. They're through-hole soldered on parts. Just desolder the crystal filter, desolder the crystal. Actually, that's a filter too. But I'd take those 2 parts off, and again, I've just given myself easy access, where right now, it's impossible to come in from 2 directions, and even from the other 2 directions where you do have access, you still can't, you can see I can't even get this spudger down in there. There's just no room. If you need to work on, let's say this, you need to take that capacitor off right there. There's, on one side, yes, it's easy to get to. You can easily get to this side, but how are you going to get to the other side? And that's occasionally, a lot of times, what I'll see. You'll see the plastic coating on these electrolytic capacitors. There could be anything, but you'll see it melted. Why take a chance on damaging stuff? And worse yet, you'll usually see people end up damaging the circuit board, so the circuit traces. And trust me, I speak from experience. Trying to repair these little tiny microscopic circuit traces is time consuming to do properly. It's not like the old days where the circuit traces were this big, like the SWR bridge. That was a standard circuit trace size, something like that, or even half that size. You can see this little tiny one that's running beside it there. It's a lot harder to repair stuff like that. But yeah, if you run into access problems, remove the part that is causing that access problem. So, remove this capacitor. If you have to, remove this shield, remove this capacitor, whatever you have to do. These are easy to remove. They're through-hole parts. That's what all these other solder connections on the bottom side of this board are. Those are the through-hole parts that are very easy to get off. Once you take them out, you now have very easy access to get in here to those parts. Like this little transistor right here, you need to get to that transistor. Well, I'd take this inductor out. Okay, this big inductor. I'd take the shield and the inductor out. Because one of those solder connections is underneath of the glue that's holding that inductor, or that choke, from moving around in there. I need to get that glue off. Like I say, just take the part off. You'll find life is so much easier working on this kind of stuff if you do that. Now parts out here, easy to get to. But again, I would still remove the faceplate of the radio, because now I can come in, again, at a very comfortable, basically rest my hand on the bench. Oh, here we're just, actually that soldering iron's on, let me turn that off. But I could take this soldering iron, and instead of having to come in at a steep angle, by having the faceplate off, and that's where I say about ergonomics are very important when you're doing surface mount work. If you're working in an uncomfortable direction, your hand's more likely to shake, or you're just going to have harder time soldering to the board. Now, a lot of times if I'm forced to solder down like this, I'll use a bent tip. So you have tips like this. Okay, they have a little bent tip. Instead of being straight like that one, it has a little bit of an angle to it. But that allows me to come down in at a steeper angle, but still get the soldering iron tip to lay flat on the board. But like I say, a lot of times it's just as easy. Just remove something like the faceplate. Now you can easily get in here and work in this area here without fear of stabbing the board, damaging a circuit trace. I think the biggest thing is practice. I say that all the time, and I'm going to keep continuing to say that. If you're going to work on surface mount stuff, practice, practice, practice. The big thing is, don't practice on this. This is your radio. Well, this isn't your radio. This is somebody's radio. But don't practice on something you're trying to actually repair, or something that you're trying to modify. You damage this, then you have to send it to somebody like me to actually repair it. What you should do is I mean, good Lord, nowadays I think most people have a junk computer laying around. I would suggest, or talk to your friends. Hey, any of you got an old laptop that you're getting ready to throw out? Can you have it? Anything, remote controls. I mean, good Lord, you can go on eBay and buy box lots of junk circuit boards. A lot of times you can find those if you search for gold recycling. Just type in circuit board gold recovery or gold recycling, and you'll see people selling lots of 10, 20, 30, pallets full. If you don't really need that many, but if you get a small lot with maybe 5, 10, 15 circuit boards, there's thousands of components on that board you can practice on. The big key there is you're not practicing on something that you're actually trying to fix. You're practicing on a junk board. If you damage the junk board, no loss. That's what you bought it for practice. Or you can buy purpose-built practice boards. They get expensive though. That's why I'd recommend just buy some junk stuff. Stuff that's being thrown out. Now, like I say, ask friends if they've got an old whatever, but it's a whatever modern device that has surface mount components. Practice taking those parts off and putting parts back on. Once you can successfully remove and install parts on a junk board, then you can move on to working on actually doing repairs or modifications, and you'll have some practice in, and you don't have to worry about damaging. And I actually have to look at this really close because I don't know if there is possibly some circuit damage on this. I don't think so. I'm actually just looking through the viewfinder. Yeah, it looks like the circuit traces are fine. Actually, it looks like there's a piece of that that diode still there, the actual lead. Looks like they probably just ripped it off. So, yeah, luckily they didn't tear the trace off. That's another problem. You'll see people removing parts like these with a pair of pliers. Bad idea. Again, tiny little traces. It doesn't take much force to rip that trace off. Three things can fail. The connection between the end cap or the lead to the part. The solder connection can fail, which is ideally if you're trying to rip something off with a pair of pliers, that's what you want to happen. Or the circuit trace can fail. You got to remember, it's just a little bit of epoxy holding that copper down to the circuit board, and a lot of times that's what I'll see, and that's usually the damage. That's what I'm talking about, damages. Somebody tried to rip a part off with a pair of pliers, they rip the circuit trace off, now they're screwed, or they use a soldering iron where the tip is just way too big for the work that they're doing. This tip, honestly, is too big for the work that I'm going to be doing down there. Honestly, when I go to repair that, I'm going to use something like one of these, even smaller tips, very small, but As you can see, they're appropriately sized for the pads that I'm working on. I don't want a really big monster tip. You try coming in with something like this, your standard soldering iron, like you'd use if you were soldering in a through-hole part, or like if you were soldering in these connectors right here on the back side of the board. This is a perfect tip for doing that. But you can see the tip is bigger than the part that's in there. These little resistors, you can see how it's just way too big. It dwarfs the part. And what you end up doing is damaging the board. Another thing is, watch your tip temperature. Ideally, you're doing through-hole stuff. Yeah, your granddad soldering iron, honestly, will work just fine. There are better things out there, but yeah, it works just fine for doing through-hole stuff. But when you get into the world of working on surface mount parts, you really should have a soldering iron station where you can very precisely control the temperature of your soldering iron tips. It doesn't need to be an expensive paste like I use. I mean, shoot, for the hobbyist, I'm sure the Chinese knockoff versions are probably fine. You can pick up one of those things. It's just as long as you can get decent tips. They don't need to even be super durable, because if you're only working on your own stuff, it's not like you're going to wear these tips out. I buy the best there are because I use these things on a daily basis, and I don't want to have to be replacing them, weekly or monthly. I want a tip to last for months, ideally. Where you, working occasionally maybe once or twice a year on something like this, you don't need that super durability. As often as you're going to use it, it'll still probably last the rest of your life. But get it, like I say, get one where the tip temperature is adjustable, because if your tip temperature gets too high, and you can try that if you get some junk circuit boards, okay, to practice on. Or you've even got a dead radio. It doesn't even need to be surface mount. It can be a through-hole radio. Okay, just take your soldering iron, your standard old Weller iron would be perfect. Just pick a circuit trace on the board. Just lay the tip on the board. And then hold it there for a little while though, and then take it off. What you're going to see is the epoxy actually decomposes, and what I mean by that is you're burning it away. That elevated temperature is higher than the operating temperature, the safe operating temperature of the epoxy that's used to make these boards, and you end up burning it. Now the traces are no longer attached to the circuit board, and that's the problem. Where people actually do damage to these boards is they'll come in with a tip usually that's too big, their granddad's soldering iron that has a tip temperature that's way too high. They come in here, they stay on the part for too long because they're battling trying to get it out because they've got, again, the wrong size tip. And then when they do finally wipe the part off the board, they end up wiping the circuit trace off of the board along with the part, and now they're screwed because now they don't know how to repair the circuit trace. So yeah, just be careful. Like I say, ergonomics is probably one of the biggest keys to being successful when you're working on stuff like this. Access to parts, very easy. You want to keep your hand, ideally if you can, keep your hand where you can rest your hand on the table, workbench, whatever you're using, your wife's dining room table, doesn't matter, but ideally you should be resting your hand on the table. That way it's a lot more stable than holding your hand up. Just I don't care how steady your nerves are, trying to solder 0402 or even worse yet, like 0201 size components freehand with your hand floating up in the air, it's really hard. You can do it because you're forced to do it sometimes, but it's really hard doing that because the tiniest bit of movement, it may not even be perceptible by looking at your hand, but when the part that you're replacing is that big, that little fly dropping right there, yeah, the tiniest bit of movement is huge in the scale of the size of the components that are used in these radios. So yeah, ergonomics. Keep your hand very steady. Remove parts that might be in the way that are very easily removed, because like I say, they're through-hole parts, or take the faceplate off. Some radios, the sides come off of the radios very easily. There's some CB radios you'll see 2 screws here where the whole side plates can come off. Uniden 980 SSBs are a good example of that. These side chassis actually come off. Take out a couple screws off the circuit board, take the faceplate off, and take 2 screws out here, and then you can come in from the side very easily. But yeah, plan your work. That's probably the big key. Another big key is plan your work. What's your route of attack to get into the parts? So I hope that helps somebody out. And again, if you're working on specifically one of these radios, a President McKinley, and you don't know how to unlock the clarifier, go watch my other video. I did that a long time ago. I showed in great detail which parts to take off, where to tap in to pick up your voltage source, about running your wire over to which pin on this socket to supply voltage up to the clarifier, because when you remove all these parts, what you're doing is you're removing all voltage supply to the clarifier control, and you need to supply one that's continuous and the same all the time in receive and transmit. But there you go. I hope that helps. Like I say, ergonomics, make your life easy. Remove parts that are easy to take off. Keep your hand rested on a table when you're actually doing the soldering. You'll find out you'll be a lot more successful. Very steady hand working on these tiny little parts, and it's probably not a bad idea. I'm pretty good at working. I can work on these parts without a using my microscope, and that depends what I'm working on. If you need some magnification, use magnification. Don't be ashamed of it. I mean, we're talking, like I say, these parts are like the size of fly droppings. So yeah, you don't be embarrassed if you need a microscope. Even the pros use microscopes when you work on stuff like this. So I hope that helps.